Hello learners, in this video we will be discussing about translation. Specifically, we will be discussing about the three topics: the definition of translation, the categories of translation, and translation studies. We will start with the definition of translation. According to the Concise Oxford English Dictionary, translation is a noun. First, it is the act or an instance of translating. Second, it is a written or spoken expression of the meaning of a word, speech, book, etc. in another language. Now let us focus first on the first definition given by the Oxford English Dictionary, which refers to the act or an instance of translating. So for this one, it relates to the sense that translation is a process, while the second one, which is a written or spoken expression of the meaning of a word, speech, book, etc. in another language, is referring to a product. This immediately means that the term translation encompasses very distinct perspectives. So when we talk about translation, it has a very wide distinction. It can talk about process, it can talk about product. So it depends on the intended meaning that we will have. Alright, so for the first definition, it focuses on the role of the translator in translating the original text or source text and turning it into a text in another language or the target text. So for this video, we will use the code ST for source text and TT for target text. So with the first definition given by the Oxford English Dictionary, it says that the translator, the one who translates, will have the task of translating the original text or the source text into the target text. And then for the second definition, it centers on the product. So when we say on the product, this is now the output given by the translator. For example, if I am the translator and then I translated English to Tausug, let's say I translated the word I love you into Tausug Kalasan Takaw, then for the second definition given a while ago, it will now refer to the product, the output that I have already given, the one that I already have translated. Alright, further, this distinction was drawn out and it appeared in the Dictionary of Translation Studies by Shuttleworth and Cowie 1997. It says here that translation is an incredibly broad notion which can be understood in many different ways. For example, one may talk of translation as a process or a product and identify such subtypes as literary translation, technical translation, subtitling, and machine translation. Moreover, while more typically it just refers to the transfer of written texts, the term sometimes includes interpreting. For this definition, we are now told that translation can touch a very wide context. So it can go to the deeper subtypes like literary translation, technical translation, the subtitles that we see in movies. So it can also include audiovisual translation, written product, machine translation. So you will always meet translation in everyday encounter. So we can have the process and product that marries computing power and the computerized analysis of language to human ability. We will now proceed to the categories of translation. According to the linguist Roman Jakobson, there are three categories of translation. First is the intralingual translation, second is the interlingual translation, and then third is the intersemiotic translation. For the intralingual translation, it is a translation within one same language. Then it can also refer to rewording or paraphrasing. For the interlingual translation, this refers to the translation from one language to another language. And then for the intersemiotic translation, it refers to the translation of verbal sign by a non-verbal sign, for example, music or image. Okay, let us go back to the first category, which is the intralingual translation. For example, we have the translation within the same language. So it's about paraphrasing. For instance, if I translate a certain language in the Tausug language, when I say, "Suway kaw mag-school maraw." Suway kaw mag-school maraw, pasal, kalagihan mo nakauwi mo. If I translate that using the intralingual translation, I will just reword it, I will just paraphrase it by saying, "Pasal kagunahan mo kabuhi mo, suway ka mag-school maraw." That's it. So I did not use any other language. I used the same language, which is Tausug. I just reworded it. I just paraphrased the original text. Now, for the second category, which is the interlingual translation, according to Jacobson, this is the translation proper. He refers to this as the translation proper because this is involving now an original text or a source text and then translating it into a target text. So, let's say if I have a Tausug language as the source text and then I have the target text as the English language, I would like to translate, let's say the sentence, "Kalasan takaw," then I will translate that into English language and I will have the output, "I love you." Alright. Now for the third category, the intersemiotic translation, it makes use of either music or image as a representation or as a symbol for the verbal signs. So this is very common. We can see this anywhere, the signages. These are the examples of intersemiotic translation. We can see when we are traveling along the road, we can see the no parking sign, the turn left sign, the no U-turn sign. These are actually the intersemiotic translation. So you would see images instead of words. That's how the intersemiotic translation works. It makes use of non-verbal signs as symbols as a translation from the verbal meanings. Those are the categories of the translation. Accordingly, translation between written languages remains today the core of translation research. Now, when we talk about research about translation, it touches another wide range of aspects or fields. So there are a lot of issues that we can discuss about when we say translation studies. One of the issues that we can talk about in translation studies is the touch of adaptation. This is under the theater translation. Let's say theater translation. You are translating a certain script into a theater play. So it's adaptation. Now the question there is how loyal the adaptation is. So it's another touch in the study of translation studies. Now, these are the things that researchers talk about when they delve into translation studies. Another is omission. Omission, for example, when you try to adapt a script into either movie or theater and then you omit some scenes there into your adaptation, then how loyal is it, or can we consider the translation loyal or accurate? So that's also an issue to discuss or an issue to debate when it comes to translation studies. Therefore, there are lots of things to be discussed in the translation research. Now, when we talk about the ambit of translation, we have this concept box. We have the three ambit of translation. First, the process of transferring a written text from source language or SL to target language or TL conducted by a translator or translators in a specific socio-cultural context. Second, the written product or target text TT, which results from that process and which functions in the socio-cultural context of the target language or TL. And then third, the cognitive, linguistic, visual, cultural, and ideological phenomena which are an integral part of 1 and 2. So this concept box, this is now the ambit of translation. For the first one, we can say that the definition of translation is about transferring, or specifically we focus on the process of transferring a written text. So we have a source language and then we have a target language. That process of transferring, that is already called the translation. If I have the source language, which is Tausug language, and then my target language is English language, then that process that I have is already translation. And this process is done by a translator or translators in a specific socio-cultural context. Now, it's also important to consider the socio-cultural context. We have to consider the socio-cultural context in such a way that the translators will be able to provide an accurate translation. For instance, in my case, I must be knowledgeable enough with the social context of Tausug and the cultural context of Tausug, so that when I translate that into English language, I would be able to use certain words that will be appropriate to the source language that I use. Or in other words, I will not have an accurate translation because I am not knowledgeable about the source language or also the target language. Therefore, there is a need to consider the socio-cultural context when we translate. For the second one, it means, or rather translation means, the written product or target text which results from that process and which functions in the socio-cultural context of the target language. So the first one, we considered it as process, the process of transferring from source language to target language. And now, the result that we have from that process will now be considered as well a definition of translation, because that is our product. So that is now our product, the written text or the target text. So that product now is applicable in the target language. So that's a translation, the product. So either it's a process or it's a product. Third one, translation can refer to the cognitive, linguistic, visual, cultural, ideological phenomena which are integral part of 1 and 2. So basically, when we talk about translation, it will always touch many things. It will touch cognitive, because we have to be knowledgeable about the source language, target language, the right words to say, the appropriate synonyms to use, the equivalent terms. Linguistic, we should also be able to understand the sentence structure, the syntax, the semantics, the pragmatics are as well very much important and significant. Visual, cultural, ideological phenomena, these things are all significant in the translation world. Throughout the years, the translation studies have really developed into a wider range of topics and issues. You can see here for the map of disciplines interfacing with translation studies. So we have here the center, which is translation, and then years ago, it just touched the following topics, which are philosophy, linguistics, literary studies, cultural studies, linguistics, and then language engineering. Then later on, from those categories or from those fields, it further rooted deeper. So under linguistics, it further rooted into semantics, pragmatics, social linguistics, contrastive linguistics, corpus linguistics, cognitive linguistics, text, discourse analysis. And then under literary studies, it touched now poetics, rhetoric, literary criticism, narratology, critical discourse analysis, comparative literature. Under cultural studies, it talked about film studies, language and power, ideologies, gender studies, gay studies, history, and post-colonialism. For language engineering, it talked about machine translation, corpora, terminology, lexicology, multimedia. And then for philosophy, it talked about hermeneutics, post-structuralism, and deconstruction. That's it for our lecture on translation for Unit 1. And at the end of this video, I'd like you to do this activity, which are the intralingual translation, interlingual translation, and intersemiotic translation. So for the first one, the intralingual translation, I'd like you to paraphrase this Tausug statement. Hinangain uno-uno ikarayaw, para lang kau makatalos mag-school. For the second, which is interlingual translation, use the same statement with the first one and translate that into English, Filipino, and one more language that you know. And then for the third, intersemiotic translation, I'd like you to list at least 3 signages that you can see around you, and then label it with the verbal interpretation of that particular sign. Good luck.